You know, the M16 replaced the M14 in Vietnam, and you may know that the M16 had some issues, but the reason that the rifle had issues is what I want to focus on today, because it is truly horrific the things that were going on in our own country behind the scenes when it came to this rifle right here. So today I'm going to tell you that story. Be prepared if you've never heard this before, because there is a lot of unbelievable stuff, but unfortunately all of this is true. If you like these type of videos, make sure that you subscribe to the channel, hit your notifications so you never miss one from me. And if you really like what I do, I'd love to have you guys join the SHOT team. You can do that here or over on Patreon. Let's go and get into it. You know, this video actually starts with the M1 Garand, which we were kind of looking to replace at the end of World War II in as early as May 1944. We had come across the G43s, the Russian SVT-40s, and we're like, okay, these guns are semi-auto, they're taking box magazines, and even though the M-block clip design was revolutionary and superior at the beginning of the war, a lot of things changed in the middle of the war that made us realize that the M1 Garand was not going to really survive past this war. Now, it actually did end up serving in Korea, but we were looking for a number of different changes to make to update the M1 Garand. And that's where a series of testing started. You know, you had the T44, T47, T48, which was actually like the FN FAL. And these series of tests, you know, started in the late 40s and into the 50s, but primarily into the 50s. You had John Garand, who obviously made the M1 Garand. He had designs. Springfield Armory had designs. And so they're trying to come up with something. They need to make sure that, first of all, it's going to have the ability to be select fire, and it also has to take at least a 20-round box magazine. And the idea is they want this one rifle to be able to take over for basically 4 different roles. So you have the M1 Garand, the 1903 bolt-action rifle, you have the BAR, and then you have your submachine gun, the grease gun, right? Or the Thompson submachine gun, right? So this gun needs to take over for all 4 of those roles and essentially make each and every soldier a one-man army in and of itself. Now, there was some interesting testing that went on. Springfield Armory actually had the advantage because they had a cold chamber. So they were able to make some changes to like the gas port to make sure that their rifle would not seize up when temperatures dropped below a certain amount. They wanted to reduce friction. And so they actually ended up winning, and the rifle became the M14. But it wasn't only the new gun that needed to be adopted, it was also the new round that we had to standardize. So after NATO was created, we basically strong-armed NATO countries into going with the 7.62x51 or the 308. While there was a lot of pushback on this, especially from the British, we had realized at this point, most countries had realized anyways, that, you know, a smaller, faster-moving cartridge actually is going to do more damage. You know, 30-06, 308, these big heavy rounds, they have a ton of stopping power, but a lot of times they will go straight through, whereas 5.56, 223, 7.62x39 tend to bounce around and actually do significantly more damage. But the United States said, hey, 7.62x51, that's the cartridge that we want everybody using, and everybody reluctantly agreed to that. Now, on the other side of the world, in the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union and Mikhail Kalashnikov had designed the AK-47, which was a strong copy of the Sturmgewehr or STG-44. And guess what that was? The very first assault rifle ever created. 30-round box magazine, detachable of course, intermediate cartridge, because the days of fighting 500, 600, 700 yards away for general infantrymen, they're long gone. But the United States said, hey, we need something like this, and this is exactly what the T-44 ended up becoming. Now this one is an interesting gun. It actually comes from an Israeli contract, and it still has the cutout for the selector switch here, which is pretty cool. Of course, it's not select fire, but still it has the cutout there, which is pretty neat. Actually has the proof mark under here, under the pistol grip. It is overall just a really, really cool rifle. And by the way, there was also the fact that Springfield said that they could make these guns with the same tooling that they used with the M1 Garand. Well, that eventually turned out to not be true. But anything that made it sound a little bit cheaper, you know, hey, all right, cool, that sounds great. But that ended up not being the case. Another thing they found out is that these things are really, really hard to shoot in select fire. And most guys would shoot them in semi-auto only. They said they kind of work like anti-aircraft guns, because after a few rounds of shooting it in full auto, you were basically shooting up at the sky. Now, by the time that gun was adopted, Eugene Stoner had finished up his design with the AR-15. Of course, he was the chief engineer at Armalite. And of course, his gun is totally different, you know. Now, of course, the original ones did not have these handguards, but for all intents and purposes, it kind of looked like this, right? You know, you had a plastic stock. The rifle was lightweight, but it also held a good number of rounds. Of course, the original ones had 20-round magazines, but more importantly, the round itself could counter the 7.62 by 39 way better than what the 308 could. And as a matter of fact, the Air Force saw the advantages with this gun early on, and they were the first adopters in the United States military. They sent 1,000 of these guns over to Vietnam, and not only did they, you know that the Vietnamese soldiers couldn't handle, you know, the M14, first of all, but second of all, they found that those 1,000 rifles did really, really well. And the thing with all of these tests done is everybody raved about the reliability of the gun. Now, Eugene Stoner, he designed this to work with an IMR 4475 powder. IMR is an improved military rifle. So that powder actually burned a little bit quicker, and he wanted to make sure he got that stuff out of there. The gas port actually stayed closed while the round was going off, so it actually stayed cleaner for longer. But the thing was, Eugene Stoner was an outsider. The Ordnance Corps was always known for kind of sticking to what worked in the past. Actually, I read this incredible article. It's actually a little bit longer, but definitely worth a read, that had said that 2 American presidents had to force the Ordnance Department to take on new rifles that were created outside of their control. They didn't want outsiders coming in. And a big part of this too is the contracts they had set up, not only for the rifles, but the ammunition as well. So after forcing NATO countries into using 308, doing their own series of testing and Arctic testing and cold chambers and all of this kind of stuff, they were going to make sure that the M14 kept its place for as long as possible, or until they absolutely had to relinquish power and actually send the M16s off to Vietnam. But they weren't going to do that without causing a ruckus. Now, in 1958, there was actually 3 military bases that ended up testing the rifle, and they all came back favorable. But the Ordnance Corps came back and said, you know, hey, we still have reservations about this. So they got the Combat Developments Experimentation Commands involved out of California to make sure that this thing went through additional testing. Well, in 1959, they issued their report, and they said, hey, this thing is favorable. Not only is it lightweight, soldiers can carry more rounds, but also when they shoot it in full auto, it's not climbing up to the heavens, and it's actually controllable. They also noted the reliability again, and that's going to come up here in a little bit. And after all these reports, it was kind of hard for the Ordnance Department or the Ordnance Corps to come back and say this rifle sucked, and they said, hey, it shows promise, but we really want to keep the ammo the same, so they rejected the design. Speaking of reliability, they actually ended up sending 1,000 of these to Vietnam early on because they knew that the Vietnamese would never be able to handle the M14, especially in full auto, and they wanted to see how this rifle did in those conditions. And out of 80,000 fired rounds, out of 1,000 rifles, there was 2 replacement parts that needed to be swapped. That's pretty stellar, dude. And there's a lot of back and forth because almost everybody else is saying that this rifle is incredible, and the Ordnance Department is saying, nah, not so much. They even went back into some of the reports when they compared the M14 to the M16, and interestingly, they found that the M14s used in those tests were hand-picked, handmade, match-grade rifles with specialized ammo, while the AR-15s used, they pulled them right out of the box. Now, in 1963, more of these rifles started to be made and sent out, Air Force special units of the Army. So eventually, the Ordnance Corps came back and said, hey, look, this rifle is not fit for military service. So they made a number of changes, one of which was the forward assist that we pretty much all look for today in an AR-15. Eugene Stoner, though, really didn't want this change. I think he was a part of congressional hearings after Vietnam talking about all of this kind of stuff. And he said anytime you had to force the bullet to be seated into the chamber, you were asking for more problems. Another thing they did is increase the twist rate from 1 in 14 to 1 in 12. Although you want the bullet to be stable, when it's too stable, you are going to have issues of potentially the bullet going straight through, which defeats the purpose of the rifle in and of itself. Because what they found was so exceptional with this gun is even though it's a .22 caliber, when it would hit flesh specifically, they tested this of course on animals, they would find that the bullets would do all kinds of crazy things. Hit somebody in the shoulder and it comes out through their tailbone or whatever. I mean, so that was part of the rifle's design that actually made it as good as it was. But the last change that they made was probably one of the most significant. And we talked about that IMR powder that was used, IMR 4475. Well, DuPont actually created that in Eugene Stoner's original design. And he wanted this gun to be about 750 to 800 rounds a minute. Well, the Ordnance Corps said, hey, we're going to use ball powder. Now, the problem with that is their ball powder, they actually wanted to get it up to a little over 3,200 feet per second, which actually wasn't necessary for this rifle, but they just had to keep up with their standards, right? So the ball powder, one of the biggest issues with it is that it actually burns slower. And by burning slower, it was actually gunking up the rifles. But it also was cycling the guns quicker, right? So it took that 750, 800 rounds per minute up to 1,000 rounds per minute, and now the guns were prone to jamming. Actually 6 times more prone to jamming than the rifles that used the IMR 4475 powder. So the Air Force, the Green Berets, all of these different military tests that they were doing, when they sent the guns over to Vietnam, they all spoke highly of this gun's reliability. And now, all of a sudden, we're getting guns into the hands of soldiers, and they're complaining about these rifles. Sometimes there would be units that would come up behind other units, and they would just see these guns laying on the ground because they would just leave them behind. And, there were some guys that wanted to keep their M14s. Even though those were uncontrollable in full auto, the wood would swell in that kind of environment, they at least knew the gun was going to work compared to this. Now, of course, there were some other issues there as well. Cleaning procedures was something that had to be, gone over. They also did chrome lining and stuff like that. They also made some changes back here in the receiver so they wouldn't rust. But those powder issues specifically, and the powder they were using, was a big part of the cycle rate and causing these guns to get way dirtier than what they were originally designed because, again, the powder burns slower. Now, here's where it gets downright criminal, the things that the Ordnance Department was doing throughout this whole thing. Colt eventually came back in 1964, 65, and said, hey, we're not responsible for these Army's tests. We've told them, that, hey, this is not going to work with ball powder. It moves too quick. They set it to like 850 rounds max. A lot of the rifles were well over that. And so the Ordnance Corps said, well, use whatever ammo you want. Well, Colt had millions of rounds of the IMR 4475, so that's what they used for the tests. But the Army was put on notice that, hey, these rifles could have severe issues if you send them over with ball powder. So they estimate about over 300,000, 330,000 rifles were sent over to Vietnam for soldiers that desperately needed them, by the way. They were getting severely outmatched with the AK-47, and they sent those rifles over with, of course, ball powder, pretty much knowing and guaranteeing that those guys were going to have issues with their rifles. And unfortunately, a lot of American soldiers lost their lives because the Ordnance Corps just could not let go of the ball powder theory and the fact that they were actually wrong throughout pretty much this entire situation. In my opinion, when they had those congressional hearings with Eugene Stoner and other people after the war, there should have been so many people put in jail because it is downright criminal them sending over rifles they knew wouldn't work with that ammo. You know, it's interesting because this gun proved to be the way of the future, and Eugene Stoner's design was fantastic. And it's just incredible that the AR-10 was originally turned down to favor the M14. Probably a lot of the same reasons. An outsider came in and kind of threatened the Ordnance Corps, decision making and, power that they held. And unfortunately, like I said, man, it cost Americans their lives. I actually looked through some of the letters in the same article that I'm pulling a lot of information from. And some of those guys, would send letters back home and, it'd be like, hey, we don't even have enough cleaning supplies for our guns, And so people from, the Ordnance Department would come in and, talk to soldiers and kind of scold them for not cleaning them. And yet leaflets were dropped saying, hey, very minimal cleaning is needed. These guns are self-cleaning and, all this kind of stuff. So there was just a lot of misinformation at the same time. Now, eventually they did change up the kind of powder that was used. They also changed up the buffer to kind of slow down that cycle rate. And overall, the rifle performed well for a lot of years until we switched over to the M4, which again is primarily based off of this same design. So that is the real story of the M16 and its introduction into the service. And like I said, man, Ordnance Corps, I really had no idea about any of this before I started doing research. And it is quite a fascinating story of how the M16 finally made it into Vietnam. And of course, a lot of other things happened behind the scenes when soldiers were just trying to get home, essentially. So there you go, man. Love to hear your opinion on this entire story. Did you know any of the things that happened with the M16, or maybe something that you really liked about the story, or something that actually made you mad about the story as well? Love to hear your opinions about this thing down below. Again, if you like what I do, consider subscribing, and also love to have you guys join the SHOT team. See you in the next one, and as always, hold them down.